Okay, so I've left a few raspberries and blueberries for a later emergency. And what I want to do is follow the path of an American child from birth to kind of successful maturity, etc., to my present age. And the first thing that comes up in many people is dissociation and denial. Oh, that didn't happen to me. My family was great. Everything was wonderful. Trauma therapist after trauma therapist deals with the fact that their patient will sit down and describe horrendous abuse, and then the therapeutic patient will take their parent's side. They will look at the abuse they felt as a child from the perspective of the parent, as a way of showing loyalty to the parent, to the power structure, to the culture. And they will feel for the parent. Oh, I was such a bad child, oh this, etc. And the therapist cannot do therapy work, trauma therapy, until the therapeutic client is willing and able to look at those events through the eyes of the child that experienced them. Until you can look not as an adult at that beating, at that belting, at that hitting, at that shaming. Not like an adult projecting adult ego structure, projecting adult authority onto a 6-year-old boy and say, oh, that was nothing. Everyone hits their kids from time to time. Everyone loses it from time to time. That was no big deal. I had it worse from my dad. Unless you can look at what it feels like to be that child. One is participating in what is called the contract of abuse. It's really a contract of survival. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But I want to talk a little bit about the two worlds. The world of trauma, the world of loneliness, the world of silence, the world of unimaginable fear and pain, the world of insanity, and the world of privilege, the world of luxury, the world of isn't it amazing and aren't you lucky? And so I thought I would begin by just communicating how easy it is to tell these two different stories. So before going into the tragedy, the trauma of the abuse in my family of origin, I'd like to tell you a little bit of the cultural story that I've heard and grown up with my whole life. My mother was a model beauty. The perfect breasts, the perfect pink skin color, the perfect natural blonde. Her greatest happiness in life was being asked if she was my sister when I was in high school. So we have the archetypal beauty. My father was very smart, and people would tell me he's a genius. In our lifestyle, my father owned a metaphysical bookstore and a vegetarian organic restaurant. And he moved from those two businesses, I think when he was around 26. He moved. My mother was a waitress in his restaurant. They married. They conceived me. They moved to upstate New York. And he began building passive solar homes for a Rudolf Steiner Waldorf community. And he moved there so that I could go to school and any subsequent children could go to school at the Hawthorne Valley Waldorf School in upstate New York. So I grew up with an intellectual, metaphysically oriented father. I grew up eating healthy, organic, vegetarian food. Many of the many of the walls in my rooms were painted with murals, consistent with some of the themes of the ages which Rudolf Steiner talks about in his school. My father went from passive solar home building to director of an offshore currency hedge fund. From there to investing in a gold mine and selling, different hedge fund investments. And from there to living in his car and just, I guess, had it with life. My mother, after the desperation of not knowing what to do and how to take care of herself and life skills that comes from being dependent, formed a successful cosmetic company, and I'm the oldest of 5 children. We grew up in upstate New York, Sussex, England, the Findhorn community in Scotland. We went to Cyprus, a Greek island, to play out my mother's fantasies about that. Vancouver, Canada, and then we split up. And I have been told my entire life, and I'll add a few other little details. My youngest brother is such a successful evangelist in fundamentalist religions that he nearly converts me sometimes, and he's highly valued for his dedication and integrity, incredibly sincere and kind, human being. My sister has won numerous national sales awards, whether it's in brokering or it's usually sales of some kind, but in multiple categories, and is highly entrepreneurial and creative. Another brother, very, very successful in his chosen business. Another brother quite successful in his chosen business. I've achieved thousands of goals in my life, built my first house on time and on budget at age 23. And so there's a lot for this culture which is materially based. Doesn't look much at women beyond their physical beauty. Doesn't look much more at men beyond their mental intelligence and wit, and earning potential and looks as well. Their status, these are all external facades that are culturally curated. So by this standard, this is an amazingly successful family, right? Other than my father spending the last 15 or so years of his life driving around in his car and upsetting most people that he came into contact with. So, but there's a lot to point that, and this is where the cover-up begins, because as I tell the other story, see, these are the dissociation, because the feminine in our culture is sublimated. Emotions are taboo. Successes, accomplishments, talents, awards, whatever, that's to be talked about, not feelings. And not the authentic feelings, and not the shadow feelings. The self is split off, and the feelings about the self are split off. So in this context, the reason I'm telling this story is not that I feel lucky. The first time I wanted to commit suicide, I was age 13, 14, and it's come up every couple of years to at most, once a decade, the rest of my life. So much pain that I'm very clear that my overall well-being would go up by dying, because there's way more pain than joy. And so if you pull that game, you've eliminated 85% pain, 15% joy. Well, it's a good game to pull out of. It's a chronic loss. So an awareness of that, I would be so much happier not playing this game, because this game has way more pain than joy for me. Now, this is not an anomaly. There's 5 children. 3 of us deal with this. 3 out of 5. And that's a pretty high level of pain, given the depth of the biological urge to survive. To really feel like the best way for me to survive as a consciousness, as a psychology, would be to end this, get rid of this body. That's a very loud call. And suicide is currently a bigger killer for the over 50 men in America than the more than 200,000 car accidents that kill people. Suicide is a higher risk for 50-year-old American men. It's a higher risk than dying in a car accident. And cars are racing around at high speeds all the time with semi-attentive drivers. But people taking their own life to escape this pain that I'm talking about is a higher risk. And that is stunning. Meaning more people are killing themselves than dying in car accidents, because what's stunning about it is what's called the bell curve, the long train, the long tail behind those suicides. Because for every one person that kills themselves, there's 1,000 people thinking about it. And for every 1,000 people that are thinking about it, there's 10 to 100,000 that if a few things go more wrong, they're going to start thinking about it. That's a lot of pain. And for every one of those, there's a lot of discontent and dis-ease and despair and loneliness. We're dealing with a big epidemic of psychic pain. Pain within the divided self, the divided psyche, as a result of becoming an acculturated human being. Now, there's a lot of diversion around this. So, no, that didn't happen to me. No, my parents were wonderful and stuff. So that just means that you're not ready to deal with this. It took me a lot to be willing to look at this whole area. And I've been involved with personal growth and done $150,000 of questionable therapy, etc. So anyway, let's look at the life of a child, not through the eyes of the cult, not through the eyes of the parent, not through the eyes of norms, but through the eyes of the innocent child. So let's just take a moment to tune in to what it was like to be born. Something and someone who has never existed in the entire history of space-time. In many ways, a synergy biologically of both parents. So take a moment to think about how much your parents loved and hated themselves. Loved and hated the world, loved and hated each other. Where did they love themselves, the world, and each other? And where did they loathe, hate, dissociate, disown, separate from themselves, the world, and others? Which truths were welcome? And which truths could never be talked about? And how much pain were your parents in? Each of them. And do you know what that pain was? And did they know what that pain was? Were they in touch with it? Or did they put on the little, oh, we're fine, we're fine? Did they convince themselves that there was no pain behind that there was no grief in their lineage? Did they let you see them? And believe it or not, there was an interesting study that, around predicting the well-being of children. One of the big correlations is whether you fully knew and understood your family's history. That in system theory, family constellation and system theory, you don't just come in as a blank slate. You have a particular role to play in your family's system. But if you are not conscious of your family system, you don't understand why you're playing that role, or that role has nothing to do with you other than you're the one available to play the role. And so there's a lot about this, but there's an interesting correlation in one study. What's the biggest factor in a child's happiness? And it's understanding their family's history, so that they don't carry the shame and guilt of grandfather, one or two generations ago doing X and it being a family secret, but it's in the energy. And when energy is suppressed in one area, it bubbles up in another area, and it usually bubbles forward. It's mom and dad can't talk about their shame. Suddenly their child will play it out. The child doesn't know why. But it's because it's the unexpressed energy trying to bubble up, into the space. And so get a little sense of, do you know your family's history, its secrets? One of my lovers was Catholic, and she had shame around having an abortion, and shame around not being as good a mother to her son, and shame around she liked to look normal, but when her pain came up, she liked to smoke marijuana. She had some shame and defiance around that. And, other wounds that came up along the way. So, but did you have the kind of relationship where that could be talked about? Or did mom and dad, or mom or dad, punish you for trying to see them in the area of their addiction, in the area of their wound, in the area of their hypocrisy, in the area of their lack of integrity? I want to be like this, but I'm behaving like this. I tell you to be like this, but I'm behaving like this. I tell you that I'm great, but I'm doing the same things that I tell you that you're not great. Like, how does that work? How does it piece together? So just take a moment to sit with that, and then I'll begin. So my first memory was of being chased by a large dog that I heard was my parents' dog. And the dog would chase me through high grass, and I was 2 years old, so I couldn't run, and the dog would smother and chase me. And I do not remember being rescued. I remember the panic, which opens up the cortisol doorways, opens up the fight, flight, freeze helplessness that is part of regressing to our reptilian state. Fight, flight, freeze, survival. My next memory is of my mother screaming and looking at me in rage and hate and fear, because the oven has just exploded in her face and singed her eyebrows, and I'm who's there to take all that fear and hate. She's just discharging, and I have no idea what's happened, but I feel like I've done something terribly wrong. That look communicated that something was horrible with me, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And she was having a fit after that and was not in a place to help me feel okay about myself. So I felt ashamed and unwanted. As I had my feelings of what's so bad about me, I need reassurance. I need to know that I'm okay. That wasn't important. What was important was her venting out her anger and rage and frustration, all the self-criticism and things that she felt, had to be vented out. And I just felt like that's my job, is to be vented on. My next memory is looking at a dirty floor and hearing that if I cross over this fence, there's this giant bull that could kill me. So I have to be very careful, and the farmer has to be very careful, and that this bull has killed, this bull almost killed this farmer. He gored him and broke one of the farmer's ribs, and the farmer just escaped. I had no context. Why are there bulls? What's going on here? Things go black again. My next memory is I'm tickling and poking my sister alternately. I'm about 4 years old. I tickle her and make her laugh, then I poke her and make her cry. Then I tickle her and make her laugh, then I poke her and make her cry. And I'm not conscious of it. I become conscious of it as I look over and I see my father watching the interaction. And I immediately feel like I've done something wrong. Like I'm bad and I'm going to be punished. This may tie in with the not very clear memories, but the suggestive memories of my father reading the Old Testament to me in a very grandiose voice about how God tests his chosen people, how he asked this father to take this boy up on a mountain and kill his son as God's will. And then he was about to kill his son, and then God said, okay, you've proved you're good enough for me if you're willing to kill your son for this. And my father is looking at me, and I'm expecting to be punished. This mythology projected out into the ether of a sociopathic, all-powerful being that seems a bit crazy. I mean, you just look at the details. You know, it's like, so I'm God, and I could give my people a cell phone or a GPS, because I'm all powerful and I'm all knowing and all loving and all this. I could just give them a GPS and say, go to this coordinate, here's the promised land. But nah, that's not very interesting. It's much more entertaining, isn't it, to have them wander around in a desert for 40 years. Why give them a cell phone when they can have stone tablets that can get broken and misinterpreted and all this, and then be waiting with a lake of fire to burn them alive if they disobey me? This sounds much more like Dad than any deity worth honoring. And yet this is the deity. This is the projection. That what's up there is a fucked up father who is 10 times worse than my dad. And the message from my father is, you're lucky. Because I may beat you, I may whip you, I may terrify you, I may humiliate you, but you don't see me about to chop off your head with a sword to do God's bidding, i.e. you've got it easy. Just wait till you die and you've got, a sociopath just waiting for you. Now, there's some blurry memories about the Old Testament and the Norse myths, Odin and Thor, again, violent sociopathic deities. Terrifying and overwhelming to a 4-year-old or 5-year-old boy. A sensitive 5-year-old boy. And here I am poking and tickling. I'm not conscious of it. I am replicating the energy and the behavior that's come towards me from my parents. I'm instinctually copying the template of how they have treated me. And I feel ashamed at 4 or 5 years old when I see that I'm being watched. And I realize that I'm curious. I'm not engaging as a human being. I'm curious. I'm in a sociopathic state. And again, it takes a lot to induce a sociopathic state in a 5-year-old. And I don't have all the memories of what went on. The memories I do have are traumatic, including this one. Now, I expect my father to punish me, but he does not. I expect him to intervene and protect my sister, but he does not. He watches. And I have not been able to connect emotionally with my mother or my father until this point. And we are living far out in the wilderness. Remember that great crusade to move to rural upstate New York? And if you haven't been to rural upstate New York, you have no idea how different it is from the city. We were a mile or so for the closest neighbor. And so whatever is read to me and whatever is done to me is my entire world. Rudolf Steiner did not believe in radio. He did not believe in TV. So there is no radio and TV. My entire world is shaped and influenced by 2 parents who, we will learn later, had undiagnosed PTSD from their own cycle of abuse and were both terrified of feeling feelings. And they're being asked, without any training, without any oversight, to raise an innocent child, a total of 5 innocent children. And I'm confused why my father is not intervening. But I get a message in his eye. You and me are the same. We like hurting people. There's a sadness, there's an understanding, and this shame, the connection of shame, is the one thing we have an emotional bond on now. And it feels disgusting, and I don't like myself in that. At the same moment, it's exciting, because this is the first time my father has bonded with me emotionally. Is the look of shame that says, you and I like to hurt people. I understand that. I'm not going to punish you. I'm not going to protect your sister. This is our bond. We are the same. What do you do when you need emotional regulation? You need to develop a muscle. And the only emotion that's present in the space is shame. A toxic, overwhelming emotion. A traumatic emotion. And the shared empathy comes from the shared pattern of hurting innocence. I don't have the memories. I have a memory shortly after that of being dragged around in a sack inside the house, up and down the stairs. The memory I have is finally getting my head out of the sack on a stair landing that my father has dragged me up the stairs. And it's not enough for my father to hurt me, to humiliate me, to disorient me, to make me feel helpless. He needs to feel that he's not a bad person. And so the thing that he asks me for after every one of these painful games is, wasn't that fun? And if I tell the truth, he wants nothing to do with me. But if I smile and pretend that being tormented was fun, he will give me more attention. He will torment me some more. And I will have a chance to grow. I will have a chance to learn constancy. You need stable templates to bounce off of, to learn where you're different. You need human presence as a child to know where you're different, to know what causes what, to learn impact, to have agency. And the only way I could earn that was by suppressing the terror and pretending that being hurt by my father was fun. And I wonder how many parents feel the need to push the edge out of hostility, out of envy, out of anger, to the point where their child is helpless, the point that the child is scared, the point that the child is terrified. And how many mind games get played? I remember a favorite of both, it's more my father, but both parents. You complain about the abuse, and they'd link the abuse just like the tickle and the poke, the tickle and the poke. They'd link the abuse to ice cream or doing something fun. So you'd say, I don't want to be hit. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. No, I don't want to do that. Oh, that's fine. We're going off to get ice cream, but I guess you don't want to do that. It's like, no, of course I want ice cream. I don't want to be dragged around in a sack. Well, you said you didn't want to hang out with me. That's what we're doing now. And it's this constant confusing game where he's a 6-year-old traumatized little boy himself. From the PTSD of my grandfather in the Second World War. From the alcoholic abuse of a sociopathic mother. My mother's parents are no different. Tuned out, violent and abusive. Unable to bond. The terror of connecting with their inner children and the amount of abuse that was suffered. So they don't want to feel anything. But they want to live their feelings vicariously through the symbology of the child. It's a little bit like the Greek tragedy, you see. When you play the character with a character on the play, and you watch your daughter being killed in the play, and maybe you kill your daughter in the play, there's a tragedy unfolding with adults. And they're understanding and empathizing with all of the different roles, and they're reliving their traumas indirectly. And when a parent is in an emotionally illiterate culture that has infected them with severe psychological abuse and dis-ease, the child becomes the object in this game of objectification where the parent doesn't want to go into their 6-year-old self and feel devastatingly overwhelmed, humiliated, and shame. But they need to deal with the feelings that are in the space that they're suppressing. So they evoke them in the child. They become the abuser, much like the drama acting in the Greek tragedies. They become the abuser, only it's not a game for the child. Only it is the child's trauma. The child becomes the object of traumatic therapy, used so that the parent can bring up the same terror they never resolved in themselves in their child. And through the nuanced expressions and behavior of their children, as their children often become like the parent through the abuse cycle. The parent understands and makes a certain peace with their parents and why their parents abused them, because now they're the abuser, and what they must have felt but are unwilling to feel or unable to feel in the dissociated reptilian state that is triggered in that domain of trauma. That they act out the drama that is too overwhelming for them to consciously deal with in a culture that does not support parents in this way. So back to as the child. It was my job to feel all the terror my father felt, all the shame and humiliation my father felt, all the numbness emotionally that my father felt, all the helplessness that my father felt, and to show my father what that felt like. That was the first part of my job. The second part of my job was to tell my father that he was not a bully, that he was not a sociopath, that he was not being unkind or unreasonable in any way, that he was a wonderful man. The second job was to cover up the abuse and make my father look good to himself and feel good about himself, or I would be punished, or I would be disowned, or I would die. When a child before language sees hatred, rage, insanity, envy, violence, hostility in the faces of the parents. You fucking infant interrupting my sex. Shut up. The hostility, the rage. And this is the provider, the only link with survival. The child has one language. I'm bad and I'm going to die if I keep up doing what I need to be doing, which is expressing my needs and expressing my authentic feelings. A parent doesn't have to say a word. When they consistently show hatred, rage, helplessness, disgust with a child behaving one way, and then reward, bribe, and pamper the child when they behave another way, the child learns the contract with the abuser and the parent just by face language. Now, a parent can say, oh, I wouldn't have killed my child. The child doesn't know that. The desire was in your face, and you were my link with survival. And it wasn't until I stopped telling the truth, stopped crying, stopped asking you questions about your feelings. It wasn't until I changed my entire nature that you stopped looking at me with the desire to kill me all the time. A child doesn't feel safe when they see the intention, regardless of whether it would be acted on, to hurt the child. When a child sees the hatred, the rage of a child, of a parent towards them, which is a normal thing to express for an adult abused child with PTSD in a culture that does not teach parents how to parent, in a culture where the parents before were even worse. We look through the eyes of the parent. We say, oh, mom and dad were doing the best they could. They raised us better than they were raised. If you look through the eyes of the child has to answer the question, what do I have to feel, do, say, think in order to survive and not be hated and not be completely alone with these people who have taken me off into the wilderness and can't bear to face these parts of themselves and these parts of me, and so I've got to figure out what's going on, and I've got to start shutting parts of me off and dissociating and putting on an act so that they can hurt me and pretend it's not hurt, because the part of their wound that needs to connect with their feelings needs to hurt me. And then the part of them that is the conscientious, New Age, Waldorf, blah, 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 needs to feel that they're wonderful parents. So how can they get both? Just reward the child for telling a lie and let them know that if they don't, there's a murderous rage that's beneath the surface if the child doesn't cooperate. This is terrifying. I had PTSD before I was 5 years old. There was no relief from the loneliness. I started having nightmares. The nightmares were so, I became hyperactive. To escape the panic, hyperactivity, nightmares, bedwetting, the fear of leaving the bed, and I would have these dreams that, it's like, I need to pee, I don't want to leave my bed, there's monsters everywhere. The panic of the projected parents into the mythological space, populated by the demonic figures of an Old Testament god, of Odin, of Thor, this just stories of hell. And the unknown is populated by the imagination. In the dark, it is the energies and images that are suppressed during the day that come up at night. Because the psyche does not tell lies. Children do to please their parents. Parents do to look good about them, to feel good about themselves. So I would wake up, and I couldn't get out of bed because I was so terrified. But I needed to pee, and then I would have a dream that I was at the toilet. And it's like, finally, I don't have to decide what to do. And I would wet my bed. Every single one of these things is traumatic symptoms. Hyperactivity, bedwetting, nightmares, the scared look in my eye, the sociopathic behavior towards my younger siblings. When someone is abused, particularly when they're young, they will do to the younger one what was done to them. The impulse in me to torment my younger siblings is a diagnosis of a pathological parent. This doesn't come out of nowhere. But the child is led to believe by superhuman parents who can make no mistakes. See, because the 6-year-old little scared little boy that my father was and the 4-year-old scared little girl, both emotionally numb, both needing to hurt people in a certain way, and both needing to pretend that they're wonderful, perfect parents. They couldn't make mistakes. They were perfect, which means that this is one of the ways shame gets passed on. And so they would point, along with every member of the cult, they would point to the murals on the walls. They would point to the healthy organic food. They would point to babies dying in starvation in Ethiopia. They would point to what terrible children we were. And the story seemed to line up. It seemed to be that my parents were these superhuman, wonderful parents, and that everything wrong in the house was our fault. Well, since we had no agency in the house, since we were in truth following my parents' script, this is a problem that can't be solved. My parents need to hurt us, and my parents need to feel that they're perfect. And the only way to solve that equation is to shift the responsibility to the child and get the child to feel small, hurt, helpless, and apologize to the abuser for causing the harm that is, in fact, the responsibility of any healthy parent to engineer. So this is the situation. Now I go off into school with great terror. Why? You see, when you've been abused in psychic space by demonic deities, when you've been abused in nightmares, when you've been abused by your parents and asked to lie about it, and when you've been told that all of this is love and you're very lucky, but you feel small, helpless, alone, and scared. Do you want more love? Do you want more of that? No, everything out there is terrifying. And the most terrifying thing about it is you're told that this is luck, that you're lucky. If you're really lucky, you'll get hurt like this some more. So you don't want to go out there. So school is terrifying. And none of the teachers, none of the Waldorf teachers, implied that there might be anything wrong at home. It was the same message. We are Waldorf teachers. You're lucky to have us. One of the Waldorf teachers would send me down into the basement of the kindergarten, and she'd say there were witches that would eat me up. Now, this is a child separated from media, 5, 6 years old, who is dominated by these giant people who define reality. And this plays on the games of my parents. My parents would take us out into the forest sometimes, and then they would find it very funny when they would disappear and we'd feel completely abandoned, which is how we felt our entire childhood emotionally. And they'd wait for us to be hurt and scared and lonely before they would come out, because that's how they wanted to play, to make a little innocent child, much like their own little innocent child, feel helpless, numb, alone. And then this was asked to be funny, and we were shamed for having feelings. They would do whatever it took to induce the helplessness, the fear, the shame. And then they would shame us for having the feelings they had induced. And they needed to do this so that they could pretend that this was fun. How many tears does an infant need to shed before you have to ask yourself as a parent, are you enjoying this? The transference of your helpless child to the next generation? Is this the most pleasure you can engender? Or are you someone that wants to nurture and protect that child, not only from your own sociopathic impulses, but from the many impulses in a sociopathic cult that is founded in so many ways in the indigenous betrayal of treaties, in the slaughter of animals, in the desecration of so many parts of the environment, in the generation of garbage. You see, the Indians didn't have garbage. It takes a very immature culture to create the illusion of waste. In an ecological system, there is no waste. Every bit of energy is necessary, and it's part of the whole, and it's part of a cycle. But in simple cultures, I only want this bit, and that bit's bad. So that's waste. We don't want that. I want this little cute little smile from you, but your anger, that's bad, that's waste. Simple cultures do not invite the whole psyche to come in. Do not embrace the minorities and the diversity in the circle. They take a clock face and say from 12 to 3 o'clock, that's good. The rest of the hours, we want nothing to do with. They take a life cycle and say, ooh, we don't like you as a baby. You're useless. You're weak. We don't want that. But from 18 to 35, ooh, you're cool, hot, and sexy. We want that. And then you're old. We throw you in the garbage. A culture that creates the illusion of waste is an abusive culture. So my Waldorf teachers didn't look at the terror on my face and say, what have your parents been doing to terrify this little boy? That the unknown is so horrific based on what he's experienced. No. That would be protecting the child. They didn't protect me from the nightmares created and populated in my brain by my parents. They fueled them. Go into the cellar where you'll be eaten by witches. And it's your fault because you're hyperactive. It's not our fault for not knowing that hyperactivity is a symptom of undiagnosed trauma. No, we don't make mistakes. We don't make mistakes at home. We don't make mistakes at school, but you are a mistake. The child gets this in no uncertain terms. What little hesitant voices I tried to give to my terror were shunted aside. You want to understand a child, it's easy. You make them safe, you make them comfortable, you stop punishing them, you stop leading them and bribing them and threatening them in different ways, you stop shaming them. You ask them how their body feels. Their body will be more honest than an acculturated mental cover-up. When you learn you could die by telling the truth, you stop telling the truth very quickly. The body doesn't lie. It's one of Alice Miller's books, The Body Never Lies. They could look at the body and diagnose the parents. They could look at their own behavior and diagnose trauma. Or they could feel self-righteous and self-important that they were Waldorf teachers, and anyone who had the good sense to hire them must be amazing parents, because that's what good parents do, hire Waldorf teachers. So it's a self-aggrandizing society. The parents will make the teachers look good and betray the child to the teachers. No, I'm sure you were a bad boy. You had to be put in the basement. It's your fault. No, I'm sure you were a bad boy. I'm sure your parents had to beat you because you're such a bad boy. So let's have all the adults gang up on the child and not validate a single one of his authentic feelings. And then throw in little crazy making absurdities like you're supposed to always be honest, don't be a hypocrite, be generous. Let's induce PTSD in a child to where they cannot feel like a human being. And then let's tell them they should be feeling love. They should love their parents, the fourth commandment, a commandment from God. We are going to induce you into a sociopathic state where you cannot feel anything except fight, flight, and freeze, and terror, in which love does not exist as a possibility in that state. And then when you're in that state, induced by us, we're going to command you to feel love, and then we're going to shame you if you don't. This is a recipe for insanity. It is a recipe for loneliness. It is a recipe for terror. It is a recipe for PTSD. And it is massive abuse. And what this cult does is it turns a blind eye. Oh, your mom's very pretty. Oh, your dad's so smart. Look at what a good man he is. He heads up the Cultural Freedom Fund. Great, isn't it? He's a passive solar home builder. He's not a adult 6-year-old boy with PTSD who loves hurting his children. Everyone's going to cover that one up. Because the teachers betray the child to the parent because the parent is paying their salary. The parent betrays their child to the teacher because if what the teacher is doing is wrong, then the parent might have to look at the fact that what they're doing is wrong as well. And since they don't want to look at their own shadow, they've got to protect the other abusers who are doing the same thing. Everyone's doing it, it's fine, it's normal, that's how you raise children, da-da-da-da-da. The beatings that I received are so terrifying that I left my body. They're so terrifying that I can vaguely see a little boy being beaten from far away. But nothing can compel me to go into that little boy and be beaten on the inside, to be present for what it's like to be lonely, terrified, in shame, in PTSD, hyperactive and not able to regulate because there's so much terror. Hyperactivity creates the environment of misbehavior, quote unquote. Meaning you can't have a coping strategy of, let me distract myself from this terror by rushing around madly and then do thoughtful and intelligent things out of that coping strategy. No, you're going to break things sometimes. You're going to not be still when you're told to be still because you've got a bigger concern. This panic is so big. How do you manage it as a 6-year-old boy? And then the beatings, terrifying. There is not a single memory I have of being the child beaten. My memories are looking at it from the outside because it's too painful. I desperately need love. And I'm being beaten and shamed for my parents' negligence so that they can feel good about themselves. Now, when you cannot feel what it was like to be that child because it's too overwhelmingly painful, what's left to identify with is the parent who's saying it's no big deal, you're bad, it's necessary. Alice Miller writes the book, For Your Own Good. The blind spot culturally sustained about the brutality and the suffering of children that is culturally sanctioned in the form of corporal punishment. It's a horrific experience. Now, when you are shamed, when you are terrified, when your deep truths are blocked because your abuser does not want to hear them, when you have a contract that is clearly scripted, that your job is to pump up your abuser, make them feel important and wonderful, when you know that that's your job, and that's the only reason you exist, is to be used by them to feel good, to play out their different abuse cycles, to be played off in one another as the marriage deteriorates, this and that and the other. This is not, we're not dealing with the human brain, we're dealing with the human animal that's trying not to be hit and traumatized. This is the brain that cannot learn. So I was rapidly diagnosed with a learning disability. Not an inability to manage my parents' violence, not an inability to manage my parents' lies, but a learning disability that had nothing to do with my parents. So again, the whole round of, aren't you lucky that you have parents that are willing to hire a psychologist to tell you what's wrong with you, but who again protects the parents. The psychologist writes, it's clear that Dane's parents care a lot about him by this and this and this external standard. But she never asked about the beatings. She never asked about the nightmares. She never asked about anything that could lead a trail towards the abuse of my parents. And like so many people, they tell the child, ooh, you are lucky. You have wonderful parents. They tell the child before asking the child what they see and what they want to see. And then you know that you can either pretend that their version of your parents is real, and then they'll reward you because you make them feel comfortable. Or you can tell them that they're wrong and be attacked for being an ungrateful child, for being uncomfortable. And in many cases, for example, again, the psychologist is being paid by my parents. And my parents are not paying the psychologist to diagnose their abuse. They're paying the therapist to diagnose my learning disability, which has just apparently come out of nowhere, as if very intelligent children who are being beaten, lied to, betrayed, abandoned, having nightmares, very intelligent children who are experiencing trauma on a systemic basis, realize that writing "See Cat Run" is the most important thing in their life. More important than stopping the next beating. You see, what we're really looking at is a level of stupidity on the part of the entire culture around this child, who doesn't seem to be able to grasp the idea that to a child, "See Cat Run" is not what's going to help them stay alive. But fidgeting and restlessly moving about might help them jump out of their body and escape some pain. Talking incessantly may distract them from some of their grief that they don't know how to deal. That they can't cry because the parent is more committed to the lie that they're wonderful. If they cried, they might have to say why they're crying. If they told the truth, the parent might have to face something they've let the child know in their body they can't face, they won't face. They'll hate the child for asking them to face that. So the teachers, the psychologists. Now, what about the peers? Are the peers in this culture receiving so much nourishment, etc., that they're generous and saying, "Hey, you look scared, what's wrong?" Or are the peers exacerbating the cultural chauvinism that humiliates and bullies sensitivity and feelings because they are feminine, and does it most in sensitive boys? What do you think? So does this boy have a learning disability, or do his parents have a learning disability? Does this boy have a learning disability, or do his teachers have a learning disability? Does this boy have a learning disability, or does his culture have an unwillingness leading to an inability to learn about shame and abuse that is going on in a large percentage of American homes every single day, and that is being covered up in a sophisticated defense that begins with "it's not happening," continues with "my child likes it, no, they're fine with it because I've bribed them to tell me that I'm a great parent for hurting them," continues with "it's not a big deal," continues with "it's necessary," continues with "what can you do," continues with blaming the child. It is a systemic program of blindness to the fact that we are a trauma-illiterate culture that pass our disease onto our children because we don't want to deal with it, so we don't learn how to deal with it. We don't know how to deal with it, so we don't deal with it. So our children have to deal with the unfinished business we've left in the energy field, that we shove down their throats at a trauma ratio in which we seem like 30-foot giants weighing 2 tons. And they're just 6 foot and weighing 100 or 200 pounds. The ratio, if you had 30-foot giants that you depended on, shaming, shaking, bullying, beating, lying, laughing, humiliating, you'd be in a traumatic state today in a matter of a week if you were bullied by 30-foot giants, and that's the experience of a child without the coping skills yet of an adult. So that child goes from the trauma of birth and learning all about life and helplessness and all that to the unspoken trauma in the family. And if you've ever broken an abuse contract and seen the level of hatred and rage in your abusers, that you did not do what you were told, you did not fulfill the terms of the agreement. You were supposed to smile and like that abuse, but you asked the question that can't be asked. Why do you want to hurt me, Dad? I don't want to hurt you. Shut up and do what I tell you to do. It's like if you see that rage, you experience that. You realize the intensity of hostility, of envy, of helplessness. It is devastating to realize that you've got that level of control over a parent that you depend on, and that they're going to gun for you if you break their law, whatever it is. It's an unspoken law. But anyone who looks at the pattern of behavior, what couldn't you feel? What couldn't you say? What couldn't you do around so-and-so? We'll watch this defense pattern. Oh, well, I couldn't possibly. Well, that would be unkind. Well, look at all the money he spent. And look at it. It's this constant protection that betrays the child. Because no amount of murals on a wall offsets trauma-induced nightmares that are lived in real life. You don't spend your day looking at murals. You're forced to look at those nightmares. The terror of being beaten is not offset by organic vegetarian food. It's chauvinism, the overvaluing of the masculine, the physical, and the undervaluing of the psychological, the feminine, the emotional, the mental, to presume that it would. I went through my entire childhood into adulthood without a single compassionate witness that wanted to know what it felt like to be me. And with dozens of giant adults using their platform of authority to tell me I was wrong, bad, incorrect, should be grateful, should be. An ignorant statement. You don't should feelings. They emerge organically. If you help a child feel safe and secure and that they belong and that they are loved and all of them is welcome, you do not need a commandment that you shall love your parents. Love is the most natural thing in the world. And if you hurt, shame, traumatize, abandon and betray your child and tell them it's their fault and that you don't make mistakes, hatred is the most natural emotion in the world, because that is what you are receiving. You are receiving enormous hatred from people who are too cowardly to admit that they hate you. From people who hate themselves so intensely and are protecting their own abusers by calling it love. You're receiving enormous hatred in a powerless state, which is one of the best possible recipes for generating enormous hatred. And it is only someone with incredible emotional illiteracy that would plant a plant and pour salt and toxins all over it and then shame the plant for not growing. That would shame a child for not loving the parent who hates them. This is ignorance. And it is self-loathing to sustain that level of ignorance. the most important repair mechanism is a compassionate witness, an adult, who will take the stand for that child and fight for their right to exist as they exist authentically, and will help the child climb their hierarchy of needs without trauma. I, as this wonderfully lucky upper-class American boy, did not have a single adult. Instead, there were numerous other betrayals, not telling us about nudity in the larger culture, such that visiting relatives would take photos of the nude children and laugh and tease and look amongst themselves. The children were never in the joke. Excluded. One of the big psychological games when you isolate, in the name of the great Waldorf education, when you isolate the great areas of abuse, is the exclusion. The child is on the outside of the joke. We're not going to include you. We're not going to give you access to media where you could include yourselves. We're part of another culture that you don't know about, and in that culture you're ridiculous. But in your culture, isn't it innocent and wonderful that you don't have a clue that wandering around nude at 10 years old is somehow questionable, that having your auntie take photos of your genitals and this is questionable, having your mother giggle and put baby powder over your genitals and whole body and show interest and curiosity in you is, without you knowing anything about sexuality, is a violation of the protecting principle of the parent. And of course, none of this exists. Complete denial. The denial of parents who are quite happy to ignore the fact that 3 of their children are suicidal, and will tell them how it's all their fault. They're quite happy to sell off the authentic feelings and the impact they have on their children for the delusion of the story they'd like to tell about themselves, and which so many stand by, ready to protect, to validate, not the child's story, but the parent's story. So the consistency is what's so damaging about this. If there was one adult in this story that spoke the truth and advocated for the child, that's all it would take for the innate truth within the child to fight off the 95% of lies around. But when you have 0, when every single adult, usually in a professional relationship, is in collusion with your parents, has an agenda of their paycheck over your sanity and your well-being, and understands the unconscious contract, the abuse contract that the child has already signed. It's the same contract a professional signed. I had an abusive father vehemently humiliating his son and telling me, please do something with my son. At this stage, I was a business owner. So I hired his son. And first thing I did was tell the son what a fucked up father he had. That's the truth. The father cut off the money. It's the only time I haven't gotten paid. You see, the father said, I have a fucked up son, put him to work. He's worthless, you don't even have to pay him. I'll pay his wages, because he's that worthless. He wasn't worthless at all. He was a young boy who had all of his father's vitriol, hatred, and shame dumped onto him. And his father kept setting him up to fail so that he could humiliate him. I wasn't playing along. Well, that's easy. See, I'm breaking the contract. So Dad doesn't pay me and threatens legal action because I tell the truth to his son. Do you think his father's going to apologize? No, he's going to punish that boy for having the audacity to turn some of the slime the father's been dumping on that boy his whole life back to the father and ask, where did you learn so much hate, Dad? Where did it come from? Maybe it's time to stop nobilizing your father and give some of it back to him. Nobilizing your mother, protecting her lies. You're sacrificing me to protect them. And they're dead. I'm not. You have a responsibility to me. You have no responsibility to those parents. Your truth does not condemn them. Their actions condemn them, whether you speak them or not. You speaking the truth does not give them bad karma. If they fuck up an innocent child, that is whatever bad karma that is, whether anyone talks about it or not. The only question is, are you going to be silent in the spell? Are you going to pretend it doesn't exist and then pretend to your child that it doesn't exist, who will then pretend to their child that it doesn't exist, as one generation after another gets infected with the disease called trauma? So we're working our way out. We have the child, we have the family, we have the school, we have the church. Thou shalt love thy parents, you are a sinner. You think that lifts shame? No. You have the church. You have TV and the media telling, particularly young boys, you have to be cool. Now, which is the coolest brain? The spiritual, transcendent, we are one state through the endogenous DMT, the newest regions of our evolution. Is that the cool part? Or is the cool part being sociopathic? I don't care. I don't need you. You can tell how much abuse is in a culture by how cool it is to be cool. It's not fun to be cool. You have to be perfect. You have to be sociopathic. You often have to hurt other people. I don't care. She dumped me. What a bitch. She was a good fuck. That's cool. Oh, I want to be like him. I don't want to feel needy. In other words, I want to be a reptile because reptiles don't feel all the pain that this culture generates. I don't want to be a human being. It's too painful to feel this cult's abuse cycle through human eyes. I want to be a reptile. I want to be cool, cold, sociopathic, not empathic and warm, cool. In cults with amazing levels of trauma and abuse, being cool, indifferent, sociopathic is very desirable because what it means is pain medicine. You've escaped the pain cycle, not by healing the pain, but by being so indifferent you can be an abuser and not care about anyone else. Like, whoa, you just went up and punched that guy, didn't care what the teacher said. Whoa, that's cool. In other words, you have achieved total sociopathic state. I want to be like you. I don't want to be terrified. I don't want to be lonely anymore. I want to be cool. So we have the media promoting this. We have the betrayal of government. We require you to have a driver's license to keep adults safe. You do not require a parent license to keep your child safe. Cars are more important than children. You have the bullying of peers. You have the whole the biggest repair structure is close friendship. And there might actually be 5% of a classroom or a group of peers who are capable of having a healthy, healing male friendship. But the cult has something ready for you. You spend too much time with another boy, you show tenderness, you show tears. Oh, we've got a plan for you. You're gay. Okay, I'm gay. No, you don't get it. You are sensitive and emotional and feminine, which means you're worthless. See, we're not saying this is a compliment. We're saying you're worthless. We're saying we're going to make your life miserable. We're going to attack you as the expression of feminine energy that is loudest amongst your male peers. We're going to attack you. You share a hug? We're going to attack you. Everything that you could do to repair your trauma, we have got you covered with hatred and hostility, with stupidity and ignorance. We're going to zero in on the medicine that could set you free. We're going to gun for you, just so that no one else gets any illusions that you get out of this fucked up country or childhood with any dignity or humanity left. You want any dignity? You be a fucking sociopath. You be cool. And don't show sensitive energy. That's for girls. Fucked up losers. Oh no, I'm not a fucked up loser. I'm a sociopath like you. Okay, this is a cool girl. A masculine sociopath. To have any value at all. It's devastating. So that's your avenue with your peers. As you move a little bit older into work, is sensitivity welcome at work? Do you have a job where when they say, how are you doing? You say, well, I'm glad I escaped high school, but I feel pretty cut up about it. I feel pretty confused. I don't know. I've got all these different messages and stuff. I feel like this. Well, that's enough of that. Just get your work done. We don't want to hear about your feelings. You want to get ahead? Make quick-witted remarks. Be cool. Put on a facade. Be a sociopath. You go to therapists. First of all, let's dump some shame on you that you need a therapist, because real men don't need therapists. You go to a therapist, and many of them are not trained in trauma, which is the key thing you're dealing with. I spent $150,000 on therapy before a single person asked a single question or made a single recommendation or a single diagnosis about trauma or PTSD. The single biggest symptoms I've been exhibiting since I was 4 years old. I read a few books myself from a stranger in a cafe. Get this, $150,000 of therapy, complete silence about trauma and PTSD. I'm being abused by a therapist, sexually under psychedelics. I can't cope. And a stranger in a cafe invites me to learn a few things about trauma. It takes me 10 minutes to realize what's going on. It takes me 10 minutes to download the book. I'm working on it that day. A stranger in a cafe serves me better than $150,000 of therapy. Now, when you start dealing and uncaking this huge explosion of trauma, when all the emotions start to take shape, you learn very quickly that they're completely overwhelming. They don't fit into 50-minute hours. I want nothing to do with a therapist that says, come in, fall apart, wrap it up, and get out of here. I want nothing to do with that. And so our therapists looking and asking the questions to figure out where you're at. Mine weren't. So that they would know what to prescribe in the way of learning, books, practices, so that they would know how to structure the relationship to be optimal for the patient and their recovery. No, they've got an economic box going on. And their box is not based on the optimum healing protocols of their clients. It is based on an economic model that goes something like this. If you're on insurance, they'll only cover X hours a month. So that's what we're going to do, because money is more important than your healing. If you're paying yourself, you probably can afford even less. So that's what we'll do. And if I want to make lots of money, like other people running BMW factories or whatever, I've got to schedule lots of people and charge them for 50 minutes. I'll charge them for an hour, but they'll only get 50 minutes so that I get a 10-minute break. And with lots of people, they're not going to make many progress, but they have enough cash flow to keep going for some years. And I'll just sit there and do what I do, whether it works or not, whether they get better. I've gotten hurt about a third of the time I've worked with healers. They've never offered a refund. You see, this is chauvinism again. If you take your laptop in and it comes out with egg all over it, they'll fix it and you don't pay for it. You go into a therapist that fucks up your brain and they charge you. They take no ownership. They don't ask how it was or how they could change. And your job is just not to come back. Which, if you've got abandonment issues, may be a little bit of a difficult thing in any case. And so, as we go into therapy, it's about 20% of optimal. I think it's better than nothing. But therapists and therapy can itself be a source of shame in the same way you might imagine. You have to remember that unlike physical illnesses, like if someone gets into a car accident, no one blames them for having a broken leg. But if someone gets caught up in someone's trauma and disease cycle, and they feel terrified and traumatized in a way that looks irrational to an abuse-illiterate culture, now you are blamed. Why don't you just get over it? Well, I would like to. It's just my neurochemistry is not cooperating. What neurochemistry? It's just in your head. You're absolutely right. My neurochemistry is in my head. And you're an illiterate son of a bitch who isn't going to take the time to learn about how these things come about, but is going to just shame me so that you do not have to offer support. Because if I can give you a lecture, read this book, get over it, now I can feel good about myself, like I fixed you. And you have to now go do it. And if my advice is crap, I'm not going to admit it's crap and apologize for giving crappy advice. I'm not going to admit to shaming you. I'm not going to apologize to abandoning you. But if my advice is crap, you'll get to fail and feel bad about yourself. And if you grew up in an abusive household where it was always your fault, everything the parent did was wrong, you can have choking up coughs as you talk about different topics. And people will pretend it's the allergies, rather than that not a single adult stood by you as a child. And so this is a very cruel protocol from childhood into adulthood. And then you meet partners, of course. Now, in America, the statistic is that more than 60% of people are dealing, or more accurately, not dealing, with varying levels of unresolved trauma. What that means, you put two of those statistics together, you now have a 120% probability that at least one person in the relationship is dealing with trauma. You then overlay that with 2 or 3% trauma literacy within the entire culture that thinks it's more important to teach algebra than it is to teach a single hour about a single human emotion from any kind of a scientific or psychological sense, and you have a recipe for failure. Because the latent trauma is part of that pain cycle that's going to come up. The addiction that's part of the pain management cycle is going to be more important than the relationship, which means 1 or 2 people are regularly betraying the relationship for their pain management strategy and usually covering it up because that's what their parents did. And it takes someone when they're in an incredibly vulnerable and needy state to be betrayed and abandoned for porn or narcotics or prostitutes or whatever the addiction is, or work. Again, another broken promise, and the love dies. Now you have a new shame. I'm a failure as a partner. You see, you're not a failure as a partner. This culture has failed you. It has failed to teach your parents about the psychology of emotion, the single most important thing that every human being needs to learn. Every human being, not a sociopath. A sociopath doesn't need to learn this, but a human being needs to learn this. How emotions work. How joy can deteriorate into hate. How hate can ascend into joy. What's the mechanism? What is the pathway? How is it built? Let's stop referring to chemistry. It's just chemistry without actually looking at what the words mean. You see, when you read the formula for a chemical compound, it goes something like this. Turn butane torch to 270 degrees. Put 2.1 grams of psilocin in a container. Burned off 30% of the vapor over a 3-minute period. Pooled this, added anhydride, mixed this for the next 36 hours at 0 temperature, added this, added that. This is not just chemistry. It is a detailed, nuanced recipe of how one form of matter transitions into another form, is then divided and becomes another form with this part of it, is then added to this to become another form. And if you follow the chemical molecule transition, you can see an exact recipe of how this state in matter becomes this state in matter with incredible precision. The exact same thing is easily doable with emotions. This is exactly how 10% peak joy deteriorates into mild boredom, lifts into excitement for 6 minutes, droops down into inattention, moves over here into resentment, becomes envy, becomes jealousy, becomes hostility over here, moves into, and you can track that. You can track the energy molecule by molecule from one state to another and understand the causative forces if you want to be emotionally literate. But in a chauvinistic culture leaning way over here, we suppress emotional literacy by shaming questions. We shame the unknown, femininity. The unknown, femininity. We shame curiosity, just crowd management. We shame sensitivity, femininity. We shame need, weakness. We shame feelings, weakness. And we don't teach a single goddamned hour about a single emotion, let alone the full spectrum of emotional states. We don't teach a thing. And then rather than own the incredible cruelty, the incredible ignorance and stupidity of subjecting our children to this abuse, of entering puberty without knowing a thing about our or their emotions, after being violated by parents who didn't know a thing about emotions. Rather than own our own stupidity and arrogance, our own chauvinism and hubris, our own cruelty, we shame the adolescents. We humiliate them for bumbling around in a way that is almost as stupid and ridiculous as teaching chemistry, saying, well, about this time, all kinds of chemicals are going to coming into the room. We're not going to teach you what there are. Just experiment, do what you want, light some of them. Some will explode. If they do, we'll laugh at you. It's a joke. If you get poisoned by one chemical compound, well, I guess that's just life. No, it is emotional illiteracy is what it is. It is sustained chauvinism is what it is. It is intense cruelty to self and to others is what it is. And it takes an effort of deprogramming and an effort to take the 1,000 plus hours that a subject that consists of a third of the human experience. There is not a single moment in which multiple emotions, multiple feelings are not occurring at the same time in our bodies, affecting our thoughts, motivating every single behavior, every single action that we have ever taken, every single action that any human being has ever taken throughout the history of time has been stimulated, has been motivated by an emotion. Emotion. The feeling leading to motion. That's what we're talking about here. Now, we're going to lecture you on the motions you're supposed to make, but we're not going to teach you a goddamn thing about the emotions that lead to all those emotions, that lead to that activity. It is absurd. It is barbaric. But we have a great way of defending against the absurd and barbaric. We look into the past, at the barbaric absurdity that's gone on even more back there. And we say, well, it can't be that bad. That's what they did back then. This is progress. And depending on how you look at it, it may be progress. But is it intelligent progress? For people to learn geometry, algebra, a cockamamie version of history, leaves out most of the important things. Is it intelligent to learn all those before we learn a single thing about emotions? This is the wall that we're dealing with here. It is a wall of ignorance. It is incredibly multi-layered. It's very weak because it's got nothing to stand on but this momentum. And yet the numbers of people that will take a stand and say, I'm going to give myself and my children an emotional education. Okay, I've gotten some mental education in school. I'm going to give myself and my children and my friends an emotional education. We're dealing with way less than 1% of the population going about this in any kind of a formal way. And the thing about this is it's a big deal. There's some debate. There's a lot of stonewalling and walling off of truth, but an author named Lloyd Demas has talked about psychohistory, the connection and correlation between patterns of childhood abuse and the wars that we irrationally fight. It's a compelling read. It's banished in many sources. And whether or not, my opinion is that there's some exaggeration going on. But that exaggeration is also, you see, I noticed that in the areas of my life that not a single person validates me, that's the area I exaggerate. Because I'm trying to compensate for the stonewalling that's going on. It's like, I know it's a big deal. And if a big deal is worth a half of a second of your time, and I know it's worth 3 hours of your time, now I have to make it into this ginormous deal so that it's worth the time it's actually worth, because the measuring system is faulty. You see, in a chauvinistic culture, feminine energy is automatically devalued. It gets 10, 20 cents on the dollar. Masculine energy is automatically overvalued. So it takes a lot of work to get feminine energy taken seriously, to be honored in the same way, because the bias is so thick. But I think there's a reasonable hypothesis that most of the irrational wars have come out of childhood psychology, in the same way that most of Trump's behavior, positive and negative, is emerging out of his abuse cycles. And it's a mix. There's the healthy parent, the abuser, and the coping mechanism. It's a mix. We can learn an enormous amount about our leaders' motivations from their childhood, more so than the rationality of, gee, it's a wonderful thing to invent evidence to go off and kill 500,000 innocent Iraqis, to punish them for weapons that don't exist, on evidence that we manufactured from completely absurd sources. It's like, and this was rational to put trillions of dollars of debt onto our children, or was this hostility? Was this a reenactment of trauma? And that's the topic explored in the book. So we're coming now to the adulthood and the options for dealing with trauma in adulthood. Well, you can go to a group, spend 1 or 2 hours. I've checked around some groups, and you can pay $140 for group therapy. And if you study the landscape in Bessel van der Kolk's book, you learn there's a lot of incompetence in treatments, whether it's drugs or it's talk therapy. Desensitization is very favored and not very effective. You have things like eye movement, back and forth with a little LED light. It seems to be very effective. Just nobody knows how it works. Family constellation can be effective, but it also depends a lot on the therapist's dynamic. But one of the patterns that I think is very important to keep in mind is that we betray children when we give their innocence in trust to emotionally illiterate, abused adult children without any oversight. That this is systemic national abuse of children. That the abuse will demonstrate itself in a child as hyperactivity, ADD, learning disabilities, meaning that when someone is abused, they've got more on their mind than see cat run. They've got their priorities in the right place. The culture does not. Once this continues, they will be shamed for the learning disability. They may be teased and bullied and picked on because the pathology of the culture dictates that whoever needs the most help, whoever is the most feminine, whoever is the most vulnerable, and whoever is therefore the most abused at home is the one who is picked on most at school, because the protocol is abuse the one who is abused, not to help them out of the abuse. When you have sociopathic protocols applied to an entire peer group, it is rare to find more than 5-10% who will stick up and actively help a bullied and abused child. That is a sickness. That is not the child's fault. They are speaking of a sickness they have caught from their parents, who are not taking a stand for their own vulnerable inner parts, who are shaming those parts, and now it's happening in school as bullies who were abused. See, because it's no fun being a bully. Bullies who were abused now abuse the most vulnerable part in the group. So they are bullied and shamed for being bullied and shamed. They develop a learning disability which hurts their future prospects, for which they pay the price for their parents' negligence and the school's lack of intelligence to teach emotional literacy. They're then punished in the workplace because they are not confident. Why would you be confident? If you've been bullied and hurt your whole life, why would you be confident that you're a valuable person? You've been told your entire life you're worthless. So you're punished for not being confident. You're punished for having symptoms of PTSD. You're punished for having a learning disability. And now you're shamed in the workplace and paid less. But while you're paid less, now you have to go out and buy therapy from someone who is not designing the therapy from a commitment to study trauma and get you out of there as soon as possible, whatever it takes. They've designed a protocol that brings in a certain amount of income every month. And whether it works or whether you feel worse, you will be paid without apology. You will be paying that bill, whether it works or not. A third of it doesn't work. $50,000 down the drain with 30 practitioners. It's not going to be done very effectively. One of the reasons is that the most potent doorways, once you're ready, is to do psychedelic work, which your government has comfortably banned from science for more than 40 years. Banned from science. Just blocked out promising research in LSD, MDMA, ayahuasca, just kiboshed, shamed. So the very tool that could help all of this abuse and could help people realize that it's not their fault and wake up to the truth, you will now be traumatized by your government with a SWAT team breaking down your house for trying to get out of the hell the government might have done you the favor of training your parents to avoid. And there's one more thing. This is going to be a long, drawn-out process. I've paid up to $24,000 a year for therapy so that I could run a business without going insane. Seems reasonable position. I mean, you're supposed to spend your money as a business owner in the way that is in the interest of the business. Well, is it in the interest of the business that you go crazy? Is it in the interest of the business that you take out passive-aggressive energy on your clients or your team? Not really. So I've been put into this state of deeply repressed traumatic symptoms and all that, just shoved out into the world with no apology. So now I've got to figure out what's going on in a world that shames me for talking about feelings or having depth of any kind. So what's my system? Just start with this therapist, see if it works, start with another one, see if it works, start with another one, see if it works, start with another one, see if it works. Go through 30 therapists. Now, when the IRS audits me and says, what's this? I say, that's the most important line item in my business. That's what keeps me able to run this business. I spend $24,000 a year on this therapy and this therapy and this therapy. Well, they say, that's not ordinary and necessary. I said, it is for me. They say, well, it's not for anyone else. I say, I don't know, I don't know where you get your data, but this is an intelligent investment for my business to have the business owner capable of running the business effectively. Not interested. I see. So they want me to pay back taxes and penalties on my healing. Not thank you so much for running a business which we take 50% of. And after we dumped your parents on you, and after we didn't send a single person to interview you, and after we designed a media system that's there to shame and leave everyone else uneducated, and after we turn a blind eye on all this, we send someone to collect your money. We don't send someone to help you as a child. We send someone to collect your money. And rather than saying thanks for getting through all that and paying us, millions of dollars in taxes, no. We're going to punish you by charging you 50% of your healing budget. So now we're at the adult level of the abuse and the shame. So we're not going to acknowledge that the abuse happened. We're not going to acknowledge it's our fault. The government could easily just say, we're going to have emotional literacy as a basic human experience, so let's teach it. Everyone feels emotions. Every action is motivated by emotions. We want to take more intelligent actions. We are going to be an emotionally illiterate culture. Here's the curriculum. Everyone's going to learn it. No, we're not going to do that. So rather than not, doing their job, they're taxing me for doing my job to get well, which is being taxed for having to pay more money, for having to work harder, for being abused, for having symptoms of abuse, from a learning disability that came from abuse that no one stood up for. And oh, by the way, we're not going to talk about any of this. We're not going to, if someone says, hey, how are you doing? And you say, well, I'm dealing with trauma. They'll say, I've had clients say, oh, that's nice. And off they go. Like, that's nice? No, they're not even paying attention. You see, we're going to have a culture where feelings don't matter so much that our favorite pastime is saying, how are you doing? And then you're supposed to lie because that's what you learned with your abuser. You're supposed to lie and say that you're fine when you're eating up inside.